Hello and welcome to the discussion of lesson 2.3 in Quantway Core. And this you're hopefully listening to before you get started. This is kind of an introduction to that. So it starts out on page 177 in your textbook, and I'm going to give a couple of examples that aren't in the textbook to get started, but they relate very directly to what you're going to be asked to do. Okay, so I'm going to use donuts to talk about our next topic. So suppose you have one donut, and then somebody comes along and gives you, all right, now suppose you look away for a moment, and when you look back, there are two donuts on your plate. So how many extra donuts did you just get? Well, in this case, the math is easy enough. You can just think about it and come up with the answer. But let's think about what actual math you would have to do to calculate this exactly. What's the difference in the number of donuts that you have? Well, when I ask it that way and you hear the word difference, you think immediately, I'm sure, subtraction. When you want to find the difference between two values, you subtract. So we're going to take the two donuts that we now find ourselves with and subtract from that the one donut that we started with, and we see that the change in number of donuts that we had is one donut. Now, suppose before you have a chance to get about to eating donuts, you turn your head again and turn it back and find that you have three donuts on your plate. And so you know just what to do this time. And you say, okay, I'm going to take those three donuts that I now find on my plate and subtract from them those two donuts I started with just moments ago. And I see that once again, my total donut count increased by 1. So those two calculations we just did have, the numbers we got from those calculations have a name. They're called absolute change. An absolute change in any situation tells you the amount of change. And here's what I mean. So in the first case, we did 2 minus 1 and got 1. In the second situation, we did 3 minus 2 and got 1. So in both of those scenarios where donuts appeared on your plate, the absolute change was 1. Well, let's look at another aspect of this scenario here. In the first situation, you started with one donut and then ended up with two donuts. And that clearly doubles the number of donuts that you have. That's a pretty dramatic change. In the second scenario, you went from 2 donuts to 3 donuts. And even though you went up in both cases by 1 donut, in this case it doesn't quite double the amount of donuts you have. Certainly the change from 2 to 3 donuts is not insignificant, but it's not as dramatic as the change from 1 to 2 donuts. So we need a way to talk about how big of a deal a change is. And to illustrate that a little more vividly, I have here on the left failed presidential candidate and billionaire Michael Bloomberg, and on the right is an average guy. And so let's say that you go up to Michael Bloomberg and say, here is $1,000. Now, Michael Bloomberg is worth at least $11 billion by current estimates, probably much more. So $1,000 to him is probably less than the value of the change under his couch cushions. It won't matter at all to him. But the average guy over here, who has a decent job, is still going to be pretty excited about that $1,000. And so why, mathematically, is the average guy a lot more excited about that $1,000 than Michael Bloomberg? Well, if we compare that $1,000 to Michael Bloomberg's total wealth, it's going to be just a tiny sliver of a fraction of a percent of his total money. The average guy, on the other hand, the $1,000 is going to be a much bigger percentage of what he has, so it's a bigger deal to him. So that's what we're going to do then, is we're going to compare the amount of the change to the original amount and turn that into a percentage to see how big of a deal that change is. So back to our donuts. In the left-hand situation, the amount of the change in number of donuts was 1. We did a subtraction and saw that the change was 1. And when we compare that to the original number of donuts, which was 1 donut, we see that 1 over 1 is equal to 1, or 100%. So that person experienced a 100% increase in the number of donuts that they had. The person on the right, however, they still had a change of 1 donut, but when you compare that to the original amount, they started with 2 donuts, then you see that that is a much smaller change, that of only 50%. So even though the number of donuts, or the absolute change, in both cases was 1 donut, in the left-hand case, it was 100% relative change. In the right-hand case, it was a 50% relative change. All right, so to make sure that we have this, we're going to do another example here. We're going to be moving away from the donuts and talking about trees. So suppose you move into a house and in 2014 and notice that there's a pine tree in the backyard, which you of course immediately measure the height of, and you determine that it is 17 feet tall. And recently in 2020, you again measured the height of that tree and determined it to be 30 feet tall. So to calculate the absolute change in the height of that tree, you're going to take the new value, that 30 feet that you just measured, and subtract from that the 17 feet, of which represents the original height. So 30 minus 17 is 13 feet. The change in the height of that tree was 13 feet, so we say that is the absolute change. Now we're going to calculate the relative change to see how big a deal that 13 feet was for that little tree. So we're going to take that 13 feet and we're going to divide it by the original value. We're going to divide that by the original value, which was 17. And when you do that division, the calculator gives you a bunch of numbers. It starts out looking like something like this, and then it keeps going. And so when we convert that to a percentage and round it off, we see that the absolute the relative change, in the height of that tree is 76.5%. So you're going to be calculating absolute and relative change, but not with donuts or trees. You're going to be doing it with the populations of some states here. So if you look over on page 178, you'll see there's 2 tables there of the populations of states, both in the year 2000 and the year 2010. All of the states in these tables here have clearly increasing populations. So choose one of the 2 groups, either the South Atlantic states up here or the mountain states down here, and calculate the absolute and relative change for each of those states. And once you've done that, that answers numbers 1 and 2 on page 179. And then go through and answer questions 3, 4, and 5.